Hazel Edwards, OAM, is best known for her beautiful picture book, There's a Hippopotamus on Our Roof Eating Cake. Did you know it's 40? It's celebrating its 40th birthday. But there's much more to Hazel Edwards than just hippopotamuses. In fact, we're going to talk to her now on Portable Magic. Hazel Edwards, how are you?
I'm delighted to speak with you. And actually, I'm still in the same house that had the leaking roof just up there. So I suppose in a sense that is historic, or just we've got an old roof.
He's not still up there, is he, with his cake?
uh, I think actually he's been overtaken by possums
Oh dear. So
in
Hazel,
our area.
that is such a loved book, and it's the way everybody introduces you. But you've written over 200 books. Do you ever feel like going, I'm more than a hippo, or are you happy to wear that?
Well, I suppose so. I tend to feel that a book belongs to the reader rather than the writer or the illustrator once it's been gifted. And so for many people, they only know about the hippo books, and the hippo book is incredibly significant to them because it typifies imagination, and that's very much aligned with young kids. So that works there. But in terms of the other things that I do, I suppose the hippos would be best known, but they're a tiny part of the other things I've done. And what I'm really interested in is the use of the imagination in lots of different areas, and probably more risk taking. And in a strange sort of way, the hippo's been a bit of a risk taker, even having people complain about him eating cake these days, his dietary habits. But I think I'm not necessarily a physical risk taker, although I have been an Antarctic expeditioner and trekked in Nepal and things like that, but which, to be quite honest, I've done by default, mainly because I want to understand why others are so keen to do those things and to write believably about someone else's, their challenges. But I think I'm a risk taker in terms of ideas. And in recent years in particular, I've picked on subjects that I have found interesting that occasionally have been a bit ahead of society's interest and written about those. And so I've collaborated, in most cases I've collaborated with someone from that particular area of cultural risk or gender risk or whatever it happens to be, mainly because I'm genuinely interested. And I suppose the themes of coping successfully with being different fit the hippo books too, because it's about having a friend who reassures you enough to be yourself. And in the other areas that I've looked at, it's possibly the same thing. And I hadn't realised that when I started out. It's only when people ask me questions like you have to think about it. But I have enjoyed continuing to learn, and also I've done a lot of collaborating, co-writing, or co-scripting, as I'm doing at the moment, so that I keep learning and I learn from the other person, and it's an equal exchange. They may have knowledge about a particular field. For example, in Hijabi Girl, Erska is a Muslim librarian, and without her cultural knowledge, we wouldn't have written that book. I like to continue to learn. So collaboration, and that's why I keep writing different sorts of things. But the hippo has moved into other mediums, and that's also a way of continuing to learn. So I think the experience that gave me the greatest satisfaction was to watch the performance of Gary Ginnivan's Hip Hip Hippo. I've got to get them all right. The hippos have so many names.
Wouldn't they
And
just stick
the
to yours?
musical by Gary Ginnivan was an absolute delight to sit in the audience with hundreds of kids, and to have my then 8-year-old grandson alongside me, who was watching a performance of something that had come from the imagination of his aunt, or his mother and his uncle. I've got to get the relationships right too. and that was a wonderful thing to be part of. So I think it's the power of the imagination and maybe the risk taking and perhaps coping successfully with being different. I'm not the physical adventurer in our family. My son probably is that. He's walked the Appalachian Trail and cycled solo from Ireland to Istanbul and is working out back at the moment as a geologist. So he's done all sorts of physically adventurous things, but he's helped me in finding out about material that I didn't know about. So at the moment I'm doing an adult mystery on the Ghan, Wed Then Dead on the Ghan. He gave me some fantastic background on the mining. So that's part of the continuing to learn, I suppose, that I like. And for me, whether I'm writing for children or for adults or for young adults, it doesn't matter. I think about a typical reader and I couch the material for them or craft it for them. And so some stories are suitable for one age group and some are suitable for another. But the hardest to write is actually picture storybook text to get it right. That is the most technically challenging.
Hazel, I was wondering when I was coming back from an appointment, driving back home, getting ready to talk to you, and I suddenly had a thought. I have no idea how you got into writing. How was it that you ended up being a writer?
Well, I had a grandmother who used to read to me before I went to school. And I think that started it. And I had a fairly unusual father. I was an only child. And in those days, girls were not necessarily encouraged to do certain things. And he'd always say, have a go. And he also used on me something that I only later in Teachers College found out was called the Socratic method. And that is, you keep asking questions till the person finds their own answers and their own solutions. And he'd done that on me for years. Why not such and such? And I didn't know it was an educational method. I don't know that he did either. But as a result, he always encouraged me to do a typical thing. So encouraged a love of maths, of physical challenge. And at that time, girls didn't do that. And if you had a brain, you were supposed to keep it quiet. And I grew up in a country area and we had a general store. And the general store was a marvellous education for a potential writer because you had to get along with everybody. You knew about fires, you knew about gossip. That was very good. It's very useful for a writer to know gossip. So my background was that my family were not particularly well off and the general store went broke. So I had to leave school at year 11 and I worked in a bank for a year. And then I went into Teachers College, but I always wanted to be a writer. And I was a readaholic. I still read in the bath, but I used to read everywhere, under the bedclothes with torches, all sorts of things. Mainly because I was interested in other people's lives. And because we were in a small general store in Gippsland, I thought there must be other very different lives outside. And at that stage, I didn't realise that it doesn't matter where you live. That's exotic to someone else. And so when I went to Antarctica, and everybody else says, oh, that's so exotic. But in Antarctica, if you are stuck on a polar base, or you're stuck, as we were, beset, it's called, on a polar ship, dealing with boredom and the use of creativity is the most important skill you can have. So it doesn't matter where you are. And that's why I often say I'm talking to children and in country areas. You are surrounded by things you can write about. This fantastic stuff here. You just have to ask, what if?
Yep, exactly. Which was your first book published?
The first one that was published was General Store, which I should have here so I can wave around to you.
Don't they say, Hazel, that your first book was always autobiographical? Then, you know, that's perfect, seeing as you grew up at a general store.
Well, if you can't read one of them, it's because it's in Finnish.
I was going to say, I'm having a moment.
It was the first book I ever had translated, and it was my first book, but it was translated. And this parcel arrived, and I thought, Oh, that looks vaguely familiar. I think that's my name on the front, but it was in Finnish, which has got lots of dots and J's. Yet to a certain extent, General Store was, but I used the setting only. What other things weren't, except for one character, Henrietta, who was a bit like the illiterate girl who'd worked for us. Absolutely kind-hearted, wonderful, wonderful girl. And in later life, I could remember the original 14-year-old girl, the 14-year-old girl I'd created in my novel, and the older woman whom I met in later life. And the one in the story was the strongest one. And she was thrilled to bits in later life. She didn't read it, but she collected it. And she always collected my books and put them on the mantelpiece. And it's valuing of stories that is so important. And she taught me so much of other things that weren't to do with words.
Yeah, exactly. So you also, as well as writing, you continue to teach. And I have it on good authority from a very dear friend of mine that you are the best creative writing teacher she had, full stop. Do you miss the writing? Sorry, the teaching?
Well, I still do, although, of course, at the moment we're in lockdown because of the pandemic. I have an adult group of writers who are connected with the Public Records Office who are writing either their memoirs or their family stories or non-fiction. So I keep teaching in that way, and I do have some individual ones, but I don't teach at the schools so much now. But to me, teaching and reading are very similar because they're both in the ideas business of finding out new things. And quite frankly, one of the reasons I think that I became a writer was I've got a short attention span and I wanted to have a really good excuse to be able to do lots of interesting things like hot air ballooning, been to a funeral parlour, what else have I done? All sorts of ice cream factory, all sorts of interesting things that have become part of my fiction. And you can tell people it's work because you are researching. And I think that was one of the attractions and that's why I ended up in Antarctica. And I feel a bit of a fraud because for many people, Antarctica is the ultimate adventure. And this is why Antarctic Dad came about, and there were other Antarctic books, but that was based, and many families use this for parents who are away from home for long periods of time. So a lot of the military, copies of this have gone to Afghanistan. Those working in mining, those working in oil rigs, and about a parent being away from home for a long time. So I wrote that, and all the expeditioners claimed that one. In fact, one of them said, that's me on the front, Hazel. I'm a legend. And I said, well, actually, it's not you. He said, Hazel, I'm a legend. So I said, yeah, you are a legend. So the difference, the fine line between fact and fiction is, again, something that authors who are long-term authors have to negotiate too, that how close to home are you going to write? Now, luckily, I have a very diversely skilled family who help me if I need to know about plumbing or infectious diseases or all sorts of things. Playing hockey, playing soccer, what's the difference between a referee and an umpire in different footy games? All that sort of stuff. But I don't usually put them into a book as such because I find that you have to respect people's privacy. And it's very dangerous having a mother or a grandmother as a writer. Very, very dangerous. If you were a teenager. In later life, it's fine. And I do have 3 grandsons that range in age from 21 at the moment to 1. And I've always written a story for each of them at each stage of their life. That is different because it's based on photographs. This is the most recent one. This is Arlo Arafura. He lives in Darwin and he's 1 now. And his dad's the adventurous one. And his dad was the one who originally thought the hippo was on the roof eating cake here. And so in that sense, yes, I have written about family stuff, but I don't actually put them in as, say, teenage characters, because I think you do have to respect their privacy. But the issues that concern them, certainly I think you need to be around the age group for whom you write, or the interest group for whom you write. And I'm a great believer in going and doing what I call participant observation, which is going and doing in order that you can write about it realistically afterwards, whether it's people's occupations or locations. If you fake stuff, it shows. And each occupation has its own language. Each geographical area has its own language. Queenslanders talk about ports and other people talk about suitcases. Just a little thing like that can make a difference in a story.
And it's those tiny details that add the magic to your story. It might be just the way you describe a blade of grass that's peculiar to that area, and it just lifts it from a story to something great.
I agree with you. It's so important to get it right. And for that reason, I ask the experts in the field, whoever they are or whatever they're doing, but I also go back to an expert reader afterwards to make sure I haven't made a mistake. And with the Antarctic novel, I had the wrong sort of fishing lines and fishing nets, and that would have been crass. But I have an expert reader. I also have one that's a mainstream reader, and that's the person who reads just for the story. And with the book Outback Ferals, which was set in Darwin, I made sure that the locals read that too. Outback Ferals actually refers to a potential plague of pandemic of pigs. But outback feral could have another meaning.
It could.
So the locals objected over. And surprisingly, in the recent pandemic, that book's become very popular. So that's another thing, that the timing of the subject matter that interests you, maybe it won't work at that particular time, but it might later on.
Hazel, what's the strangest situation you've put yourself in to get that minute detail?
I think being on the Australian Antarctic Division expedition was probably the most extreme, and we unfortunately became beset in the polar ice and a chopper crashed on top of us. Now that's the stuff that you read about in fiction. It's not, so what was really interesting to find out in those circumstances was, when I applied to go, I didn't really think I'd get in, because you have to pass an extremely stringent medical test. And most people in my family didn't think I'd make it. I didn't either. And unfortunately, they sent me the male test as well, and I didn't have a prostate. So they had to give me the other one, and I did pass the right one. And then I was eligible to go, and that surprised me. But it was a year of considerable ice, and our ship became beset. I've since found out that ships become beset other times, but not in such extreme circumstances as ours.
And generally not with helicopters on top of them.
No, the chopper bombing on top of us. Nobody was hurt. But what I came out of that with was the greatest admiration for both the safety training and the common sense of the expeditioners, but how people cope under extreme pressure. And that was very interesting to find out. And I found I was terrific. My problem is I've got an overabundant imagination. I'm great when there's an emergency on the spot. I'm terrible afterwards because I think, oh, this could have happened or that could have happened and so on. But that was interesting to find out. I think that would be the most extreme, but I really did admire some of the expeditions in that circumstance. They really were impressive. And then the problem came where you were stuck in the ice for ages and you had to use other sorts of skills to cope. And creativity was an important skill. So I would have been the bottom of the pile in terms of fitness, but in terms of creativity, you'd be able to think of new things to do. So I wrote a story and they all sent it home to their appropriate child. We did a find and replace. So the Lockieberg story about the iceberg and the child went to all over the world with a different name in, and we didn't worry about copyright on that one.
No, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so I think that would be the most extreme.
Mm. Hazel, and this is said with absolute respect, you have been in the industry for more than 40 years because Hippo's 40. How have you kept up with the changes, like in technology, in demand, in even the way books are seen? How have you been able to keep yourself up to date and as relevant now as you were then?
Things have changed in the type of writing. I think the most extreme change has been in the last 6 months in terms of the impact of the pandemic and the movement online. And I was always moving in that direction. I think audio is actually going to be even more important in terms of storytelling. I think there will always be a need for storytellers, but the medium that is used will change. I'm not particularly visual, and that's one of the reasons, I think in abstract, not in visual. And so that's one of the reasons I've often worked with a puppeteer for the movement of the visual and also illustrators. But I think now we've got to learn other skills and other ways of doing it. So I learned to I recorded for Audible the adult mystery Celibate Sleuth. Now I found that really hard to do. I thought you might be interested in my markup copy because it's got colours all over it of, you know, things that had to be read and how they had to be read and so on. I found that incredibly difficult to do, partly because I don't have an actor's voice, like some of your previous interviewees who have beautiful actors' voices. But it was important to convey what the writer had intended. And in that case, my Celibate Sleuth is an asexual sleuth, and he's Australian, not American. And the company that processes that is American. So it's very important to have an Australian voice. So audio, I think, is important. A website is important. I try and learn one electronic skill per day, and I'm a bit behind, but I'm working on it. At the moment, I'm learning the program that adapts for screen, transitions a story, which is this one, Wed Then Dead, to a screenplay, which I'm working on with a much more experienced screenwriter. And I find that hard because I'm not visual and I find the formatting hard, but it's things that you need to do. The actual writing I prefer. I like writing for the sort of 6 to 10, the hijabi girl type style is what I really like doing. But what thrills me most is when someone of imagination with a different skill, such as the Larrikin Puppet Company, are now taking this. They now have the puppets ready, they now have the music ready, they now have the songs ready. Once we move into normal mode outside pandemics, they're ready to go. I enjoy writing something like that age group. It's been said that most writers are a particular age. I think I'm either 4 or 8. I'm not sure which. 4 for the picture books, because that's the age of wonder and just awareness of words and everything's possible. And 8, because they're just starting to enjoy chapter books and storytelling. I really like that. I find the young adult mark, that readership now, although I've written quite a number in that area, probably the best known at the moment would be the F2M, The Boy Within, which I co-wrote with Ryan Kennedy, who is actually a female to male F2M, trans guy. And that language changes very, very quickly. So he is now working with another New Zealander on the graphic novel inspired by that. So what gives me pleasure is when an initial story moves into another format. I learned the format along the way, or sufficient of it, to appreciate the skills of my collaborators, and that story goes out into other mediums. That's what gives me great pleasure.
Yeah. Now let's talk about, just quickly, because we're, I could talk all
Running out of
day, but I
time?
know
Yeah.
you've got other things you need to do. The OAM, how did you feel when you were awarded that?
Well, I was quite surprised, partly because writers and creators are in a slightly different category from some other occupation. Other occupations have a lot of administrative staff who fill in forms for things like that, and authors don't usually. And so I really must pay credit, because I didn't know at the time, but to the community of writers who contributed to that, and there were quite a lot of them. I accept that one with pride, because it typifies a lot of the other work that authors and illustrators do. And I don't mean only their books. They do a lot community-wise in terms of literacy, in terms of various charities. I'm one of the Dolly Parton ambassadors. Now, she has funded picture books for children in a wide range of areas. It was started because she came from an area where most were illiterate, and she provided the picture books for those kids. She moved on to other countries. She's moved to Australia now. I think the ability to access books and ideas at an early age is crucial. That was part of the reason I think the OAM came about, but it's not just me, it's representative of a number of the others. And I would like to see more, because people outside the creative industry, we don't have an hierarchy. We have a sharing of ideas where each of us is not competing with the other. We're competing with trying to write the best story we can that has compassion and ideas, and not pieces of propaganda, but rather stories that matter and stories that endure, and help the reader see someone else's world from a slightly different point of view afterwards. Intellectual property is our greatest investment, and the people who provide that are your imaginative thinkers. So some of the children coming up now, some of our existing creators, are the most important investment that we have. And so intellectual property, and I don't mean making great profits, financial profits for the person who's invented whatever it is, but rather that we share ideas in that way, and these are the people we need. But the problem is that you're not going to get really good quality ideas unless people are prepared to risk. And one of the things we don't look at is you might have a 1 in 10 return rate on fairly unusual ideas, or odd bods, or pitches, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, I've still got several now that haven't happened. One was a series of potential animations about the vehicles and the vessels in Antarctica, which was really about friendship. Now, that didn't come off, but I really liked that one. But the chances are some things will not work on the first round. And so you've got to be able to sustain yourself long enough to persist in another format, or a time that is more appropriate. And that's very hard to do if you still got to pay the ordinary bills and get everything else done. So we should invest not so much in recognition, but in support of particularly our 20-ish artists and illustrators and graphic designers who are going to come up with new ways of doing things. But that's where you will get an improvement in a society. And so the kids who read have an entree into other worlds. And if they don't get into those worlds, they don't know how other people might have tried things.
Hazel, last question, your website is a treasure trove of things. So I point people in that direction, but there's one in particular I want to ask you about. What's a hazelnut? And don't tell me it's on a tree.
Yes, well, what's happened is across the years, I've mentored a number of people, and their books have been they finished their books, which is a real achievement for procrastinators, and they've been published. And they call themselves My Hazelnuts, you see, and it's a sort of in joke, but it's grown very much in the last year or so, because with the course I'd been running on completing a book in a year, they asked if they were entitled to be called Hazelnuts when they'd finished. So I put the manual together as a substitute for the fact we can't have classes anymore, and I put in the front the covers of some of the wonderful people who call themselves Hazelnuts, who finished, male and female, who finished their actual books. And so the Hazelnuts get a credit there. So that's what they are. And what happened was one of the earlier groups did an anthology which they called A Bunch of Hazelnuts. And then it was pointed out by illustrator Felicity Marshall, who is indeed a hazelnut, that a cultured hazelnut is a filbert. And I didn't know that. But I thought hazelnut sounded better than a filbert, don't you?
Yeah, I do. Don't be a bunch of filberts. That sounds like...
No, it sounded a bit stuffy.
It does, doesn't it? Hazel, what an absolute delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I look forward to when we're allowed out again and we can have a coffee and actually catch up for longer. Thank you so much for joining me.
I've appreciated it. Thank you.